Commander Taho Kim stood outside the meeting chamber, his palms sweating inside his formal diplomatic gloves. The corridor of the Harmony was silent except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. This was it, humanity's first official contact with the Vraxians, a species known throughout the galactic rim for their advanced technology and strict cultural practices. "Nervous, Commander?" asked Dr. Su-Jin Lee, the xenobiologist assigned to the diplomatic team. Her calm voice did little to settle his anxiety. "Just following protocol," Taiho replied, straightening his uniform for the 5th time. The briefing had been extensive, with particular emphasis on one rule: never make direct eye contact with a Vraxian, especially their nobility. Eye contact in their culture was reserved for intimate partners and close family members. For strangers, it was considered either a grave insult or, even worse, an intimate proposition. Admiral Park approached, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Remember your training, everyone. The Vraxians have agreed to consider our proposed trade agreement, but one misstep could end this before it begins." She checked the time. "They're ready for us." The massive doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a chamber bathed in amber light. The Vraxians stood in formation. Tall, willowy figures draped in elaborate robes of iridescent fabric that shifted colors with each slight movement. Their faces were partially concealed behind ornate veils, revealing only the hint of scaled skin beneath. The tallest Vraxian, wearing a towering headpiece that added at least half a meter to their already impressive height, stepped forward and raised a 7-fingered hand in greeting. "Honorable representatives of Earth," the translator in Taiho's ear converted the series of clicks and whistles into Korean. "We welcome you to discussions of mutual benefit." Admiral Park bowed precisely at the recommended angle, respectful but not subservient. "The people of Earth thank you for this opportunity, High Chancellor Krita. We come seeking friendship." The delegation moved to the large oval table. Taiho kept his eyes firmly fixed on the table's polished surface, occasionally glancing at his datapad, where he had prepared notes on Earth's resources and technological needs. Across from him sat a smaller Vraxian whose robes were decorated with complex patterns that seemed to ripple with light. The meeting progressed smoothly. The Vraxians were interested in Earth's agricultural methods, while humanity hoped to gain access to their advanced propulsion technology. Taiho began to relax as the discussions continued without incident. Then it happened. As he reached for his cup of water, Taiho's datapad slipped from his lap. Instinctively, he bent to retrieve it, looking up as his fingers closed around the device. In that moment, his eyes met directly with the Vraxian sitting across from him. Time seemed to freeze. The alien's eyes, all 4 of them, widened behind the ceremonial veil. They were a deep violet color with vertical pupils that dilated instantly. Taiho found himself unable to look away, mesmerized by the intricate patterns in the iris. The silence that followed was deafening. The Vraxian skin, visible only around the eyes, flushed a deep blue. A collective gasp went through the alien delegation. The High Chancellor stood abruptly, issuing a series of sharp, rapid clicks that the translator couldn't keep up with. The rest of the Vraxians rose as one, their postures rigid with what Taiho could only assume was shock. "What have you done?" Admiral Park whispered, her face pale. Before Taiho could respond, the Vraxian delegation filed out of the room, their robes rustling like leaves in a storm. Only the Vraxian whom Taiho had made eye contact with hesitated, looking back at him with what might have been curiosity before following the others. The human delegation sat in stunned silence. "Could someone please explain what just happened?" Dr. Lee finally asked. Admiral Park closed her eyes briefly. Commander Kim just made direct eye contact with a member of the Vraxian royal family. Taiho felt his stomach drop. How do you know they were royalty? The pattern on the robes. That was Princess Gina, the High Chancellor's daughter and heir. Admiral Park gathered her materials with trembling hands. "We need to consult with our cultural experts immediately." The next 6 hours were a blur of emergency meetings and frantic communications with Earth's Central Command. Tai-Ho sat through it all, numb with the knowledge that he might have single-handedly destroyed humanity's chance at an alliance with one of the most powerful species in the sector. As night cycle began aboard the Harmony, Tai-Ho sat alone in his quarters, staring at the stars through his viewport. A chime at his door broke his dark thoughts. "Enter," he called. Admiral Park stepped inside, her face unreadable. "Commander Kim." Tai-Ho stood at attention. "Admiral, I take full responsibility for." She raised a hand to silence him. "We've received a communication from the Vraxian High Council." Tai-Ho braced himself for news of his immediate dismissal, or worse, a declaration of hostilities. According to Vraxian custom, Admiral Park continued, her voice careful and measured. "You have initiated a sacred bonding ritual with Princess Gina." "A what?" Tai-Ho blinked in confusion. "A bonding ritual. What we would call a proposal of marriage." The room seemed to tilt under his feet. "That's impossible. It was an accident. Intent is irrelevant in their culture. The act itself carries the meaning." Admiral Park's expression softened slightly. "There are only two ways to resolve this situation: marriage or ritual combat to the death." Tai-Ho sank back into his chair. "You can't be serious." "I wish I wasn't. The Vraxians take this extremely seriously. Princess Gina is not just any royal. She's next in line for leadership of their entire species." Admiral Park handed him a tablet. "These are your options, as presented by their cultural attaché." Tai-Ho scanned the document, his heart racing. "This says the combat option would be seen as a grave insult unless there are extenuating circumstances." "Yes. Essentially, you'd be saying you'd rather die than marry her." Which would mean the end of any possible alliance and potentially the beginning of a conflict. Admiral Park's voice was grim. "Earth needs this alliance, Commander. The Maker Collective has been expanding toward our territory for years. Without Vraxian technology and support, we're vulnerable." Tai-Ho stared at the tablet, the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. "And if I agree to the marriage, then you become the spouse of the future leader of the Vraxian people, and our alliance is sealed through your union." Admiral Park hesitated. "It's an impossible position to put you in. I've requested time for you to consider your options, but they expect an answer by tomorrow." After Admiral Park left, Tai-Ho sat in silence, the gravity of his situation sinking in. One accidental glance, one moment of carelessness, and now he faced a choice between personal sacrifice and potentially endangering his entire species. He pulled up what little information they had on Princess Gina. She was considered young by Vraxian standards, merely 120 Earth years old. She was known for her interest in other cultures, her skill in mathematics, and her unusual appearance. As dawn cycle approached, Tai-Ho made his decision. The needs of humanity had to come before his own. If marriage to an alien princess was the price of Earth's security, then it was a price he would pay. But as he drafted his formal acceptance, he couldn't help wondering about the Vraxian princess whose eyes had met his, and whether she was as terrified of this unexpected union as he was. The briefing room of the Harmony felt too small for the information being shared within it. Tai-Ho sat at the round table, surrounded by experts on Vraxian culture who had been summoned after the diplomatic incident. Holographic images floated above the table, showing various Vraxian individuals in their ceremonial dress. "Let me understand this," Tai-Ho said, his voice strained with fatigue after a sleepless night. "You're saying the Vraxians don't just have different beauty standards, they have the opposite of ours." Some men, the team's xenoanthropologist, nodded. His fingers swiped through the holographic display, bringing up an image of a Vraxian with perfectly symmetrical features and smooth, uniform scales. "This is what they consider plain or common," Sungmin explained. "In their evolutionary history, perfect symmetry and uniformity were associated with lower genetic diversity and weaker immune systems." He swiped again, bringing up an image of a Vraxian with dramatically uneven features, varied scale patterns, and unusual coloration. This is their ideal of beauty, or what they would call Kethna, which translates roughly to biological complexity. The more unusual the appearance, the higher the social standing. Dr. Lee leaned forward, her scientific curiosity clearly piqued. It's actually a fascinating biological adaptation. Their species evolved in an environment with extreme radiation pressure. More varied genetic expressions often indicated better radiation resistance. Taiho tried to process this information. And Princess Gina. Sung Min's expression became serious. From what we understand, she is considered exceptionally unattractive by Vraxian standards, which means she holds one of the highest possible social positions. Her appearance is so distinctive that it marks her as royalty. So refusing to marry her would be rejecting someone of incredible status in their society. It would be like a foreign diplomat refusing to marry a human supermodel who also happened to be the daughter of the most powerful world leader. Admiral Park, who had been quietly listening, added, with the additional complication that the Vraxians would see it as rejecting their entire concept of value and hierarchy. Taiho rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a stress headache. So refusing the marriage would be an insult. Worse, Sung Min said grimly. It would likely collapse the alliance Earth needs for protection against the Mekar collective. The Vraxians would interpret a rejection as a fundamental incompatibility between our species, evidence that meaningful alliance is impossible. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Everyone present knew what was at stake. The Mekar collective had been expanding its territory aggressively over the past decade, absorbing or destroying civilizations that stood in their path. Earth's defensive capabilities were substantial but insufficient against the collective's overwhelming numbers. The Vraxian alliance represented humanity's best hope for security. You don't have to do this, Admiral Park said finally, her voice softer than Taiho had ever heard it. We can try to negotiate an alternative arrangement. It's not fair to ask one person to bear this responsibility. Taiho stared at the holographic images, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. What do we know about Princess Gina herself? Not just her appearance or status, but who she is. Sung Min consulted his notes. Not much beyond the official records. She's highly educated, with specializations in mathematics and cross-species cultural studies. She's traveled extensively and speaks several non-Vraxian languages. She's respected among their scientific community. Well, Taiho said with a weak attempt at humor, at least we'll have something to talk about. As the meeting concluded, Taiho was informed that Princess Gina had requested a private meeting that evening. She would come to the human quarter of the station, an unprecedented step that indicated the seriousness with which the Vraxians viewed the situation. Taiho spent the afternoon in a strange limbo, alternating between briefings on Vraxian marriage customs and moments of quiet panic. How had his life changed so dramatically in less than 24 hours? Yesterday, he was a rising star in Earth's diplomatic corps. Today, he was preparing to meet his alien fiancée. As evening approached, Taiho's quarters were prepared according to Vraxian protocols. The lights were dimmed to accommodate their sensitive vision, and the temperature was raised several degrees. A special chair was brought in to accommodate Vraxian physiology. At precisely the appointed time, there was a chime at his door. Taiho took a deep breath and straightened his formal uniform. "Enter," he called, keeping his eyes carefully lowered as instructed. The door slid open to reveal Princess Gina, flanked by two Vraxian guards who remained in the corridor. She entered alone, her movements graceful despite the elaborate ceremonial robes that draped her tall frame. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss. "Commander Kim," she said, her voice melodic even through the translator, "I appreciate your willingness to meet with me privately." "The honor is mine, Princess Gina," Taiho replied, keeping to the formal greeting he had been taught. "You may look at me," she said after a moment. "In fact, I insist upon it. If we are to be bonded, We must move beyond such formalities. Hesitantly, Tai-ho raised his eyes. His breath caught in his throat as Princess Gina reached up and removed her ceremonial veil, revealing her face to him alone. Her features were utterly alien to human beauty standards. Her face was asymmetrical, with one side more prominent than the other. 4 eyes of varying sizes watched him, 2 large ones positioned where human eyes would be, and 2 smaller ones set higher on her forehead. Her skin was covered in iridescent scales that shifted color subtly with her breathing, creating patterns of blue and purple that seemed to flow across her face. A series of small, feathery appendages framed her jaw, moving gently, as if sensing the air. Tai-ho fought to keep his expression neutral, knowing that his reaction was critically important. Yet as he looked at her, something unexpected happened. Beyond the initial shock of her alien appearance, he began to notice details, the intelligence evident in her gaze, the careful way she studied his reaction, the delicate patterns formed by her scales. "I understand your discomfort," she said suddenly, in perfect Korean without any translation aid. Her mouth parts moved in unfamiliar ways to form the human words. Tai-ho couldn't hide his surprise. "You speak my language. I have studied Earth's cultures for many cycles," she explained, her Korean precise though slightly accented. "Your world fascinates me. So much diversity, yet so many commonalities across your cultures." She moved to sit in the specially prepared chair, arranging her robes with practiced ease. "I know this situation is not what either of us would have chosen. In truth, I had hoped to meet humans under different circumstances." A ripple of blue moved across her scales, a Vraxian expression that Tai-ho couldn't interpret. "You didn't want this either?" Tai-ho asked, surprised by her candor. "I am princess and heir. My personal wants have always been secondary to my duties." She tilted her head, studying him. "As I suspect is true for you as well, Commander." Tai-ho nodded slowly, feeling an unexpected connection with this alien being. "Duty comes first." "Precisely. And now duty has brought us together in this unexpected way." Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence, creating a rippling effect. "I understand the sacrifice being asked of you, to bond with a being so different from yourself, from a culture you barely understand. Princess Gina. Please, when we are alone, call me Gina." "Gina." He corrected himself, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "I want you to know that I respect the importance of this alliance to both our peoples." She made a sound that the translator didn't catch, perhaps a Vraxian equivalent of a sigh. "Sometimes duty requires personal sacrifice," she said quietly. In that moment, looking at this alien princess who seemed as trapped by circumstance as he was, Tai-ho made his decision final. "For Earth's sake," he said, meeting all 4 of her eyes steadily, "I accept." The scales around her eyes shimmered with a faint golden light, an expression he would later learn indicated surprise and cautious hope. "Then let us learn to know each other," she said, "before we learn to be bonded." The Harmony's observation deck offered a panoramic view of the swirling nebula outside, gases in shades of purple and blue forming patterns that resembled Earth's ocean currents. Tai-ho stood before the massive viewport, hands clasped behind his back, waiting for his now daily meeting with Gina. 3 weeks had passed since he had formally accepted the proposal, and each day since had followed a carefully planned schedule of cultural integration activities. The wedding date was set for 6 weeks from now, barely enough time for the necessary preparations according to Vraxian customs. The soft swish of the door announced Gina's arrival. As always, she was accompanied by 2 Vraxian attendants and a human diplomat who served as both cultural advisor and chaperone. Vraxian tradition dictated that bonded pairs should never be completely alone until after the ceremony. "Commander Kim," Gina greeted him, her scales shifting to a warm amber color that he had learned indicated pleasure. "Princess Gina," he replied with a slight bow. He had stopped averting his eyes during their second meeting, when she had explained that between engaged couples, eye contact was not just permitted but expected. "I've prepared a selection of Earth music as you requested," Taiho said, gesturing to the console near the viewport, "from different regions and time periods." Gina approached the console, her movements graceful despite her height and the weight of her formal robes. The attendants remained by the door, giving them the illusion of privacy while still maintaining proper supervision. "You speak Korean remarkably well," Taiho noted as Gina examined the music selection. It was something he had wondered about since their first private meeting. Gina's mouth parts, a complex arrangement of flexible mandibles rather than lips, formed what he now recognized as a smile. "I studied Earth transmissions for decades. Your music, particularly, intrigues me." She selected a piece of traditional Korean folk music, and the soft, haunting melody filled the observation deck. Gina closed her four eyes briefly, the feathery sensory appendages around her jaw extending slightly as if to better absorb the sound. "The mathematics of your music is fascinating," she said after a moment. "So different from Vraxian compositions, yet there are underlying patterns that resonate across species." "Mathematics?" Taiho asked, genuinely curious. Their conversations had quickly moved beyond awkward formalities to real exchanges of ideas. "All music is mathematics," Gina explained, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "Frequencies, intervals, rhythms, patterns of sound arranged in time. Your Earth music uses different bass patterns than ours, but the underlying principles are universal." She proceeded to explain the mathematical relationships in the folk song, breaking down its structure with such precision that Taiho saw the familiar melody in an entirely new way. Her intelligence was undeniable, her passion for knowledge infectious. "You should have been a professor rather than a princess," Taiho said with a smile. "Who says I cannot be both?" Gina replied, her scales rippling with amusement. "In Vraxian society, leadership requires mastery of multiple disciplines. My father is both High Chancellor and a renowned physicist." As they moved on to other pieces of music, Taiho found himself watching Gina more than the nebula outside. With each passing day, her alien features had become less strange to him. The asymmetry of her face, the complex patterns of her scales, the expressive movements of her sensory appendages, all these things had initially seemed bizarre, even unsettling. Now he found them fascinating. When had that shift occurred? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Perhaps it was during their third meeting, when she had demonstrated a dry wit that caught him completely by surprise. Or maybe during their fifth meeting, when she had recited an Earth poem in perfect Korean, explaining that she found human poetry beautifully illogical. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal with each meeting. They discussed their childhoods, hers spanning decades longer than his, their duties, their dreams for their respective peoples. Gina had a perspective on the galaxy that Taiho found both alien and enlightening, her species' longer lifespan giving her a patience and long-term view that humans often lacked. "May I ask you something personal?" Taiho ventured, as they moved to sit in their respective chairs near the viewport. Gina's scales shimmered with curiosity. "You may. How do you feel about this arrangement?" "Truly." The question hung between them. The attendants shifted uncomfortably by the door, but made no move to interfere. Gina was silent for a long moment, her four eyes blinking in that sequential pattern that Taiho found oddly mesmerizing. "When it was first proposed that we seek alliance with humans," she said finally, "I was intrigued. Your species is young by galactic standards, yet you've advanced quickly. Your adaptability is renowned." She paused, her scales shifting to a deeper blue. "I requested to meet the human delegation," she admitted. "My people needed this alliance, but I was curious about humans." "About you?" Taiho's eyebrows rose in surprise. "About me specifically." "About humans," she clarified, though her scales flushed slightly purple, embarrassment, he had learned. "But when the reports came about the diplomatic team from Earth, I did study your profile. Your approach to the Centauri negotiations was impressive." Taiho felt a strange warmth at her words. The Centauri negotiations had been his first major assignment, a complex diplomatic challenge that he had approached in an unconventional way. He hadn't expected a Vraxian princess to have noticed. Of course, Gina continued, I never anticipated this particular outcome. Eye contact is a significant taboo in my culture precisely because of its implications. When our eyes met in that meeting room, it created quite a situation. That's one way to put it, Taiho said with a small laugh. But, Gina said, her voice softening, if I must be bonded for political reasons, I find myself not displeased that it is with you. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpectedly intimate. Taiho felt his heart rate increase slightly. What was happening here? Was he developing genuine feelings for an alien being he had met only weeks ago? Or was this simply the result of the intense circumstances they found themselves in? Before he could formulate a response, his communication device chimed with an urgent alert. Frowning, he checked the screen to see an encrypted message from Harmony's security division. URGNT, evidence of plot against ceremony. Report immediately. Taiho looked up from the device to find Gina watching him intently, all four of her eyes focused on his face. Is something wrong? She asked, her scales shifting to a concerned orange hue. He hesitated, unsure how much to share. The security protocols were clear. Potential threats were to be handled discreetly to avoid diplomatic incidents. I need to attend to something, he said carefully. A ship matter. Jaina's upper eyes narrowed slightly. You're not being truthful. Taiho blinked in surprise. How can you tell? Your thermal pattern changes when you're not speaking honestly, she explained. Most humans can't detect it, but Vraxians can see into the infrared spectrum. You can see when I'm lying. Taiho asked, somewhat alarmed at this revelation. Moments later, the door slid open. Enter, came Jaina's voice from within. The chamber was dimly lit and warmer than human comfort levels. Gina stood in the center, draped in elaborate ceremonial robes that shimmered with living bioluminescence, a traditional Vraxian wedding garment harvested from special deep-sea creatures on their home world. Her attendants hovered nearby, clearly distressed by this breach of protocol. Leave us, Gina commanded her attendants in the Vraxian language. When they hesitated, she added something that made them reluctantly withdraw to an adjacent room. You have invoked the blood call, she said to Taiho once they were alone. This must be serious. There's a plot against you, he said breathlessly, crossing the room to her side. Traditionalists from your own species plan to assassinate you during the vow exchange and frame humans for it. Gina's multiple eyes blinked in sequence, her species equivalent of a resigned sigh. I suspected as much. The old guard fears change. You knew. Taiho was stunned. I knew there were those who opposed this union, she clarified. The conservative faction has always resisted any alliance with younger species. They believe Vraxians should remain isolated, preserving our culture from outside influence. And you didn't think to mention this. Taiho couldn't keep the frustration from his voice. Political opposition is not the same as assassination plots. Jaina replied calmly. And Vraxian politics has always included vigorous disagreement. This goes beyond disagreement, Taiho said, showing her the intelligence report on his tablet. They plan to use a modified human weapon to kill you during the ceremony. It would destroy any chance of alliance between our peoples. Gina studied the information, her scales shifting to a deep purple that Taiho had learned indicated concentration. These are very specific details. How did your security obtain this intelligence? We've had undercover agents working since we first detected the threat. One of them managed to infiltrate the group. Gina was silent for a moment, her four eyes moving independently as she processed the information. What surprised me, she said finally, was finding myself hoping the ceremony would proceed regardless. Taiho blinked, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. What? Despite this threat, Gina clarified, I find myself wanting the ceremony to continue. for reasons beyond politics. There was something in her tone, a vulnerability Taiho had never heard from her before. Despite the urgency of the situation, he found himself responding to it. "I feel the same," he admitted. "These past weeks, getting to know you, it's not what I expected." The scales around Gina's eyes shimmered with a golden light. "We still have a threat to address," she said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "We cannot simply cancel the ceremony. It would be seen as a grave insult by many of my people, potentially causing the very conflict the assassins hope to trigger." "Then what do we do?" Taiho asked. "We proceed, but we adapt," Gina said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "I believe I know who is behind this plot. The conservative faction is led by my father's cousin, Kriven. He has opposed my ascension for decades, claiming my educational focus on other cultures has contaminated my thinking. Can you have him arrested before the ceremony?" "Without proof. That would trigger a clan dispute that could tear our society apart." Gina began to pace, her ceremonial robes flowing around her tall frame. "We need to trap them in the act, prove their treachery before both our peoples." She turned to face Taiho, her expression resolute. "I have an idea, but it will require us to modify the ceremony slightly." As she outlined her plan, speaking in Korean so any potential eavesdroppers couldn't understand, Taiho felt a growing admiration for her strategic mind. Her plan was bold, even dangerous, but it might work. "Your security team will need to be prepared," Gina concluded, "and we'll need to signal each other during the ceremony without alerting the conspirators." "We can use Korean," Taiho suggested. "Most Vraxians won't understand it, and any humans involved in the plot won't expect us to be communicating that way." Gina nodded, her scales shifting to a determined amber hue. "One more thing," she said, moving to a ceremonial chest in the corner of the room. She removed a small vial containing a swirling blue liquid. "This is cashin extract. It's an antitoxin that Vraxian royalty has used for centuries. If they attempt to use poison, this may provide some protection." She held out the vial to Taiho. "Take half, and I will take half." As they prepared their countermeasures, working together with a synchronicity that felt almost natural, Taiho realized something important had changed. This was no longer just a diplomatic arrangement or a duty he was fulfilling for Earth. Gina had become a partner, someone he respected and perhaps was beginning to care for deeply. "Your attendants will be suspicious when I leave," Taiho said as they finalized their plan. "What will you tell them?" Gina's mouthparts formed the expression he now recognized as a smile. "I will tell them you were concerned about a detail of the ceremony," a typical nervous response from a soon-to-be bonded pair. It's common enough in Vraxian culture as well. As Taiho prepared to leave, Gina caught his hand, a surprisingly human gesture from her. "Be careful," she said softly. "I find that I have grown accustomed to your presence." Coming from a Vraxian, it was practically a declaration of affection. Taiho squeezed her hand gently, mindful of the different structure of her fingers. "See you at the ceremony," he replied. "Try not to get assassinated before we finish our vows." Her scales rippled with amusement, the Vraxian equivalent of laughter. It was, Taiho thought as he left the chamber, perhaps the strangest pre-wedding conversation in the history of either of their species. Yet somehow it felt perfectly right. The ceremony began with a hush falling over the grand hall. Representatives from 17 different worlds watched as Taiho entered from one side of the chamber and Gina from the other. The Vraxian princess moved with graceful dignity, her ceremonial robes cascading around her tall frame in waves of living bioluminescence. Taiho walked with military precision, his hybrid formal attire catching the light in ways that mimicked Vraxian scale patterns. They met in the center of the hall, beneath an archway that combined elements of both their cultures. Earth cherry blossoms intertwined with Vraxian-like sculptures. The High Chancellor of the Vraxian people stood before them, his elaborate headpiece towering above the gathering. Taiho's eyes scanned the crowd discreetly, looking for signs of the conspirators. Security forces, both human and Vraxian, were positioned throughout the hall, but they remained unobtrusive, hidden among the diplomatic delegations. The ceremony proceeded according to the modified plan he and Gina had created. Traditional vows were exchanged in both languages. Taiho spoke the complex Vraxian phrases carefully, earning appreciative clicks from the Vraxian attendees. Gina's Korean was flawless, her alien voice giving the familiar words an ethereal quality. Then came the moment they had been preparing for, the ceremonial drink that would seal their bond. According to intelligence, this was when the assassins would strike. A Vraxian attendant approached with 2 ceremonial goblets on a tray. The goblets were ancient Vraxian artifacts, carved from the mineral crystals of their home world. The liquid inside shimmered with an iridescent quality. As is tradition, the High Chancellor announced, "The bonded pair will share the waters of life, binding their futures as one." Taiho took his goblet, and Gina took hers. Their eyes met briefly, a silent communication passing between them. Then, as planned, Taiho spoke in Korean. "In my culture," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "we have a tradition of celebrating with dance before important ceremonies." Gina's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, their agreed signal that she understood. The Vraxian attendees looked confused, while the human delegation appeared surprised but intrigued. "Would you honor us by demonstrating?" Gina asked in Korean, playing her part perfectly. Taiho placed his goblet back on the tray and stepped into the center of the ceremonial space. He began to perform a traditional Korean folk dance, his movements precise and fluid. All eyes in the hall turned to watch this unexpected addition to the ceremony. While attention was focused on Taiho, Gina subtly switched their goblets on the tray. It was a quick, practiced motion. They had rehearsed it dozens of times in the hours before the ceremony. When the brief dance concluded, Taiho returned to Gina's side. Polite applause rippled through the gathering. "A beautiful custom," the High Chancellor commented, seemingly unperturbed by the deviation from protocol. "Now let us continue with the bonding." They each took a goblet again, now switched, and raised them in the traditional gesture. "To unity," Taiho said in Vraxian. "To understanding," Gina replied in Korean. They drank simultaneously. The hall grew quiet as the gathered diplomats watched this solemn moment. Taiho could feel his heart racing, wondering if their intelligence had been correct. With the poison bee in Gina's original cup, now safely in his hands, had they anticipated the correct method of assassination? A commotion erupted near the back of the Vraxian delegation. A tall figure, whom Taiho recognized as Kriven, Gina's father's cousin, jumped to his feet. His scales had turned a shocked white color, and he was gesturing frantically to his companions. "She should be collapsing," he exclaimed in Vraxian, loud enough for the translator to pick up. The neurotoxin was concentrated enough to fell a mountain beast. The hall erupted in chaos. Security forces moved with practiced precision, surrounding Kriven and his co-conspirators. The accused Vraxians hissed and clicked in their native language, too fast for the translators to keep up. Admiral Park stepped forward, her voice cutting through the uproar. "We have evidence that these individuals conspired to assassinate Princess Gina and blame humanity for the attack. They sought to destroy our alliance before it could begin." The High Chancellor's scales darkened to a deep blue, a sign of grave concern in Vraxian culture. "Is this true, Kriven? You would murder my daughter?" "For the purity of our species," Kriven declared, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "These humans will contaminate our bloodlines, corrupt our culture with their primitive ideas." Gina stepped forward, her full royal authority evident in her bearing. "Your actions prove which of us truly dishonors Vraxian tradition. Our greatest teachings speak of adaptation and growth, not fear and isolation." As the security teams from both species worked together to take the conspirators into custody, Taiho marveled at how seamlessly they cooperated, a living demonstration of what their alliance could achieve. The High Chancellor raised his hands for silence. "The ceremony will continue," he declared. This treachery only strengthens the need for our peoples to stand united. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded without incident. By its conclusion, Tai-Ho and Gina were officially bonded according to both Vraxian and human traditions. The gathered diplomats applauded, perhaps with more enthusiasm than before, the shared crisis having united them in a way formal diplomacy never could. As the ceremonial gathering transitioned into a celebration, Tai-Ho found himself surrounded by well-wishers from a dozen worlds. Ambassadors who had been skeptical of the human-Vraxian alliance now spoke enthusiastically of cooperation. The thwarted assassination attempt had, ironically, strengthened diplomatic ties. Hours later, when the formal reception was winding down, Gina gently touched Tai-Ho's arm, a gesture she had adopted from human culture. "May we speak privately?" she asked in Korean. They moved to a small alcove off the main hall, still visible to the guests, but far enough away for private conversation. The events of the day had left Tai-Ho exhausted but strangely exhilarated. They had faced death together and emerged victorious. "You performed admirably," Gina said, her scales shimmering with golden hues of approval. "Your pronunciation of the Vraxian bonding vow was almost perfect." "High praise, coming from you," Tai-Ho replied with a smile. "Your quick hands during the cup exchange saved both our lives." "A successful joint operation," Gina agreed, her four eyes blinking in that sequential pattern he had come to find so expressive. Then, her tone becoming more serious, she added, "There is something I should tell you about our customs." Tai-Ho nodded for her to continue. "Our marriage customs include a year-long evaluation period before becoming permanent," she explained. "It is a tradition that dates back to our early history, when bonding between clans was often arranged for political purposes." "An evaluation period?" Tai-Ho asked, surprised. "Yes. After one full Vraxian year, approximately 14 Earth months, either party may honorably dissolve the union if they find it unsuitable." Her scales shifted to a more subdued color as she continued. "I wanted you to know that you will have an honorable way to dissolve our union when the alliance is secure." Tai-Ho was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. A year ago, even a month ago, the idea of an escape clause would have filled him with relief. This entire arrangement had begun as a diplomatic necessity, an accident turned to political advantage. But now, looking at Gina, her alien features no longer strange but familiar and expressive, he realized something had fundamentally changed. The person standing before him was no longer just the galaxy's ugliest alien or the Vraxian princess. She was Gina, with her brilliant mind, her dry humor, her courage in the face of danger, her passion for knowledge. "What if I don't want an exit?" he asked quietly. Gina's skin flushed with a cascade of colors, blues, purples, and golds rippling across her scales in patterns he now recognized as deep emotion. "Then we would have much to learn from each other," she replied, her voice soft. Their conversation was interrupted by Admiral Park, who approached with news that Earth's government had already ratified the full alliance treaty in response to the day's events. The Vraxian High Council had done the same. "Congratulations," the Admiral said with a genuine smile. "You've made history today, in more ways than one." As the celebration continued around them, Tai-Ho and Gina stood together, representatives of two species that had begun as strangers and were now allies. Their accidental bond had become something neither of them had anticipated, the beginning of genuine understanding between their worlds. 3 standard cycles later, the Harmony space station, once a simple diplomatic outpost, had been expanded to include the first joint Human-Vraxian Cultural Academy. Tai-Ho and Gina served as its co-directors, welcoming students from both species who wished to learn about the other's culture, science, and art. On the anniversary of their bonding, they stood together in the observatory, watching as ships from both their worlds traveled freely between Earth and Vraxia. Trade routes had been established, scientific cooperation was flourishing, and the feared Makar collective had withdrawn from the borders of human space, unwilling to face the combined strength of the alliance. Did you ever imagine this outcome when our eyes first met in that meeting room? Tahoe asked, his hand resting gently against Gina's. Never, she admitted, her scales shimmering with contentment. I expected duty and compromise. I never expected to find home. The word hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Home, not a place, but a connection that transcended their biological differences. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small beings who observed them. But for those beings, human and Vraxian alike, the universe had fundamentally changed. An accidental glance had transformed into a bridge between worlds, proving that beauty truly existed far beyond physical form, in the connections forged through understanding, respect, and love.